Let's go ahead and get started with science class today. We've got some more life science stuff to get through. I'm hoping to finish up life science by the end of the week. We'll see if that remains to be possible. So we spent the last couple days talking about animals. We left off talking about food webs and kind of energy flow through an ecosystem. But today we're going to focus on what exactly an ecosystem is, right? And so the components that make up an ecosystem. So we're not necessarily talking about just animals today. We're talking about the entire environment, right? So we would refer to that as the living environment. So ecology essentially is the study of the ecosystem. And you can kind of see here on this little chart down in the bottom right, the levels of organization. So you can kind of see where the majority of stuff we have discussed recently is kind of in this green section, right? That tends to be the biology. But if we look at, organization of matter from very small to very large, we kind of go from atoms to molecules to cells to tissues to organs to organisms. And then this is what we're going to focus on today, is kind of talking about this stuff. And then we move even beyond that to the Earth, the whole, the solar system, the galaxy, the universe, and it just, right? So ecology focuses on this kind of middle section, okay? So when we talk about the ecosystem, or how things are organized within this kind of classification of ecosystems. When we talk about the environment, we break it down into two parts, the abiotic and the biotic, okay? So the abiotic environment is the non-living part of the environment. And so everything that makes up the environment that isn't alive, okay? So if we take alpine lake, like a mountain way up, a lake way up in the mountains, okay, that's our environment. The non-living portion of that setting would be the abiotic environment. So the water, the rocks, the snow, if there's snow, dirt, the gravel, right? Right? All of those components make up the abiotic part of the environment, right? Even you could talk about the air temperature, the precipitation, right? The clouds. You can even factor that stuff into the abiotic environment because it's affecting the environment. Whereas the biotic portion, bio means life, biotic means the living part of the environment. So everything else. That means all of the animals in and around the lake, all of the animals in the lake, all of the, algae and the little bacteria, all of the plants, all of the trees, all the grasses, right? Those are all things that are alive. And so they make up the biotic portion of the environment. But an ecosystem includes both of those. So let's look at this little upside down pyramid here. And this is kind of going to be where we start, is how things are organized within a colony. So at the very bottom, we have organism, okay? So I'm going to skip ahead to this part here. Actually, I changed my mind. I'm just going to use the visual here. So an organism means a singular animal or a single living thing. Right? It could be a plant, it doesn't matter. But an organism is one singular living thing. Right? So if we take our example of the mountain lake, let's just pick out a random fish out of that. Let's say it's a rainbow trout. That trout is a single organism, right? And the term organism just refers to that one trout, okay? So the next step up from that would be talking about population. So when you think of the word population, what do you think of? And you think of, right, the population of Spokane is blank, or the population of Washington State, or the population of the United States, right? The amount of people living somewhere. So the population as it pertains to this particular example is the entire amount of, or the total amount of those rainbow trout in that lake. Okay? So what I mean by that is, here's the written definition, and then I'll go back to the picture. But the written definition of a population is a population of organisms is a group of individuals from the same species living in a specific area at the same time. Okay, so now that we've established that groundwork, let's go back. So if an organism is the singular trout, and we could have chosen any of the living organisms in this lake for this example, but just to kind of prove my point and kind of show you what I'm talking about, we're just looking at that. So population includes just the population of rainbow trout, so not other species of fish, not worms, not ducks, not any other living thing. The population is just referring to the number of the same species, right, that there exists in that specific location at the specific time. So in other words, population implies that it only is talking about our lake, right? For our example. So in other words, if there's a lake, a mile away, the population of rainbow trout in that lake is different than the population in our example, right? In other words, you don't include both. Those populations are separate, right? The population is the amount of the same species in a specific place at a specific time. So obviously, population doesn't include how many rainbow trout lived in the lake 100 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 1 year ago. It's how many fish, how many rainbow trout live in that lake now, right? That's population. So when we say, what is the population of Spokane, we don't include the people that live in Coeur d'Alene because they're a different population. And we don't include how many people lived in Spokane in 1920 because that was 100 years ago, right? When we talk about population, it implies a specific location at the present time, okay, or at a specified time. Okay, that makes sense? So as we make the next jump up from organism to population to community, what do you think a community is as it relates to an ecosystem? Look at the picture here. So here we've got one fish, here we've got a bunch of fish, here we've got all kinds of different animals. So the community is made up of all of the interacting populations of species in that environment. So that means the community includes all living organisms in that environment, right? So if we're talking about the mountain lake, the entire biotic environment, in other words, all the living creatures in the lake, around the lake, alongside the lake, underneath, and on the bottom of the lake, all of those living things are considered part of the community within that ecosystem. So community implies all living things, but it includes all different species. So it's not limited to just the one species of trout. It includes the ducks and all the other different fish and the worms and bugs and all the plants, trees, right? Those are all parts of the community, living community. And then lastly, ecosystem is basically the term that includes all of the living and non-living things, right? So that if I were to go back, right, ecosystem includes all of the animals, all the species of animals, all the species of plants, but it includes the water in the lake, the rocks that make up the lake, the mountain, the sand, the pebbles, all of those things make up the ecosystem as a whole. Okay, so that hopefully makes sense. So for today's purposes, we're going to stop there and just focus on organism through ecosystem. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about is some different types of ecosystems that exist globally. And so this kind of overlaps with social studies when we start talking about geography and different climates. Ecosystems are kind of the same thing, right? There are different types of ecosystems all over the world, and every ecosystem, of course, is a little bit different. But in general, a desert ecosystem or a rainforest ecosystem or a polar ecosystem are going to have some similarity, right? And so another word for ecosystems or climates is biome, and that's just another word that means the same thing, okay? So I'm not going to break down everything on this map, and you don't need to read the little tiny words, but you can see and we can tell and we know, there are lots of different ecosystems around the world, right? At the poles, there's ice, rock, there's tundra, there's forest, there's temperate forest, there's tropical forest, there's desert, there's mountainous regions, okay? And so all of those things are represented here, but we don't need to spend a lot of time on it. Okay, so I think that's pretty straightforward. With that, I'm going to stop this and pull up some questions. So we've got plenty of time, and if we end a little bit early, that's okay. This will be a good stopping point for the day. So let's just go through these questions. These questions deal with both kind of what we talked about yesterday and what we talked about today. So there might be some overlap. So if you weren't in class yesterday, I'll kind of do the best I can to kind of. All right. So let's look at number one. So number one says, according to the passage, what is the ultimate source of energy for the food web on page 522? Okay, so don't worry about the according to the passage part or any of that, right? But if we look at this food web, okay, we've got the green plants or the producers, we've got the first level consumers, the second level, the third level, right? And then all the interconnectedness between, right? In terms of who's eating what. But ultimately, for those of you that remember from yesterday, and if you weren't here yesterday, that's okay, where does the energy in this cycle really come from, okay? Because the green plants produce their own energy. So according to this, if you were looking at it literally, right, then the answer to this question might be green plants, because they're at the bottom of the food chain. But if we remember, where do green plants get their energy from? Without sunlight, green plants don't grow and don't produce energy. So even though it's not mentioned on this map, the right answer to this question is, where is the ultimate source of energy? It's D, the sun, right? Without the sun, the energy cycle wouldn't begin, okay? All right, that's straightforward. So here is another question based on this food web, okay? And then the other questions all deal with ecosystem. So, or at least I think. So this question here, sorry for my back and forth, but deals with fox. So here's a hypothetical situation. Suppose most of the foxes in that woodland ecosystem were killed and hunted. Which of the following is most likely to happen as a result? Okay, so if you were to remove foxes or most of the foxes from that food web, what would happen? Okay, now let me zoom out so I can try to not go back and forth too much. I realize that's pretty small. Now, okay, I'm gonna have to, that's gonna be as good as we can do. So if you can't read it, bear with me and I'll read it for us. Here's foxes. So where's, for the sake of simplicity, let's see what happens if we were to remove foxes from that food web entirely. So, A, the amount of plant life in the woodland would increase. Okay, so here's plant life down here. If we were to remove foxes, would that increase plant life? Well, foxes aren't directly eating plants, but they do eat animals that eat plants, so I'm going to leave A for now. It doesn't necessarily sound right, but let's read the other options first, because I bet there'll be some easier ones to get rid of. B, the population of hares and seed-eating birds would increase. Okay. Here's hares, here's seed-eating birds, here's foxes. Foxes do eat both seed-eating birds and hares, so B makes sense. Let's look at the last two. C says the population of insects and insect-eating birds would decrease. Insects, insect birds. Oh, sorry. I think I said increase. Would decrease. The population of insects, insect-eating birds would decrease. There's the first one that I would for sure get rid of, right? If foxes eat these birds and these birds eat insects, then if you were to remove foxes, the population of those things wouldn't decrease, they would probably increase, right? And D, the population of snakes would decrease. Snakes are here. Foxes don't eat snakes according to this food web, so that wouldn't affect it at all. So B, so D and C are easy ones to get rid of. And again, we looked at A, and that indirectly could be something that might happen, but the best and easiest choice here is B, right? Population of hares and seed-eating birds would increase. If there were no foxes to prey on them, then their populations would go up. Okay? All right. Let's zoom back in and look at number 3. Number 3 is kind of a silly, dumb question, but let's do it anyway. Number 3 says, which of the following is most similar to a naturally occurring ecosystem? So remember what we talked about, what an ecosystem is. A naturally occurring ecosystem would just be, an ecosystem unaffected by humans or artificial structures or artificial things, right? So remember, the ecosystem is all of the living and all of the non-living things in an environment, okay? So which of these following examples is most similar to a naturally occurring ecosystem? None of them are natural. Which is most similar? A diorama with dried vegetation and stuffed animals. B, an aquarium with aquatic plants and herbaceous herbivorous tropical fish. I don't know if I've heard that word. C, a house with central air conditioning and heating. Or D, a supermarket with a large section of fresh fruits. This is one of the most obvious answers I've seen in a while, and kind of a dumb question in terms of they don't give you any, or they don't give you really any tough ones to decide. Which one includes living things at all, right? Diorama is, there's nothing living. It's meant to represent ecosystem, but it's all made up of dead things, right? Or things that aren't living to begin with. A isn't right. C, a house with central air conditioning and heating is the worst answer choice. And D, a supermarket with a large section of fresh fruits and vegetables. B is the only one that even comes close to making any sense. That's an easy one. Let's look at number 4 and number 5. All right, so here's number 4. Number 4 says, in most cases, changes in one aspect of an ecosystem result in reactions in other parts of the ecosystem, restoring balance. So kind of like what we talked about with the fox. If you were to remove the fox from the ecosystem, then that increases the amount of rabbits and birds there are, and that impacts maybe the amount of grasses that are being eaten, so on and so forth, right? So there's repercussions anytime something in the environment is changed, whether naturally or artificially by man, right? Either way, if something in an environment is changed, then there's a ripple effect that changes other things, okay? In some cases, however, changes can be so great that the original ecosystem is replaced with another. When this occurs naturally, as when grasses are replaced by taller plants, shrubs, and eventually trees, it is called succession. So ecosystems can change. Okay? They can change naturally, and they can be aided by man, right? If we cut down all the trees and a field of grass replaces it, that has changed the ecosystem. Not naturally, but changed by the man-made change. And so both things can happen, right? But it can happen naturally, right? That's not uncommon and not unnatural, right? For environments to change over time. When this occurs naturally, as when, oh, sorry, I said that, I'm repeating myself. I read this last part. But when it does occur naturally, it's called succession, okay? Which of the following statements is supported by this paragraph? Okay. A, when changes are introduced into an ecosystem, its balance is permanently disrupted. B, succession is usually caused by human destruction of an ecosystem. C, the intentional replacement of a wooded area by a field of cultivated wheat is an example of succession. Or D, the natural replacement of lichens by mosses and ferns and then shrubs is an example of succession. Okay, so again, if I were to use process of elimination here, the first two I'd get rid of would be B and C, because it says in the very last sentence that when this change occurs naturally is when it is referred to as succession. So B and C are talking about human change. B says human destruction of an ecosystem. C says the intentional replacement, which implies that humans remove a forest and replace it with a field of wheat. Okay? Neither of those are naturally occurring. So B and C aren't right. So between A and D, what makes the most sense? A, when changes are introduced into an ecosystem, its balance is permanently disrupted. Or D, the natural replacement of lichens by mosses and ferns and then shrubs is an example of succession. Should be fairly straightforward. D matches the example they give most closely, and also B, the one word that kind of gives away, or sorry, A, the one word that kind of stands out for me, making A false or making A not the right answer, is the word permanent. The fact that they say its balance is permanently disrupted is kind of a red flag to me that that's not going to be the right answer. Right? Anytime you hear definitive words like that, look out. Right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the wrong answer. I'm not telling you that. But anytime I hear definitive statements or things that are like overly declarative, I become hesitant, right? Especially when we're talking about, in this case, we're talking about nature. And for someone to say something is permanently disrupting or permanently changing something in nature is always a red flag that I look for, right? That's not something that I want to know. So D is the best answer choice there. And then the last one here, number 5, is quite a long paragraph. So let's do it. You can either read it to yourself, or if you want, I will read it and you can kind of just follow along. So number 5 says, although more than 3/4 of the atmosphere is nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen cannot be used directly by plants and animals. Instead, certain bacteria and blue-green algae take nitrogen from the air and, through a process called nitrogen fixation, turn it into compounds that plants can use. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria are found in the roots of some plants, such as peas and beans. When these plants are present, the nitrate content of the soil is increased. Nitrates are absorbed by plants, which are eaten by consumers. Eventually, the nitrogen returns to the soil in excrement and when organisms die. Okay, that's a long paragraph. So if you listen to that, or if you read it and it went in one ear and out the other ear, it's okay. Just keep pushing through it. Don't reread it again. Just read the question, see what it's asking, and then go from there. You might have to go back and find things, and that's okay. Even if you don't think it made sense, or if you don't think it stuck with you, just keep pushing on, okay? On the science test, on the social studies test, you don't have time to reread and reread and reread, okay? So read it and be done with it. Figure out the question, and then if you need to go back, which you're gonna most likely need to do anyway, just don't worry about it, okay? That's the biggest thing I can say with reading passages is don't stress about how well you feel like you read it or how well you understand it, because these are boring. Your brain's not designed to want to pay attention to something that's not interesting, right? So just read it and don't worry about it. So the question says, what is the role of nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the nitrogen cycle? So let's look at our options, and then let's go back and see if we can find the best answer. A, to decompose dead plants and animals. B, to add nitrogen to the atmosphere. C, to turn atmospheric nitrogen into compounds plants and animals can use. Or D, to take nitrogen from blue-green algae and turn it into compounds plants can use. Okay, so even though there's a lot going on here, you should be able to easily figure out what the right answer is. The first one that I would get rid of most quickly and easily is B, to add nitrogen to the atmosphere. The first sentence says that the atmosphere is made up of 3/4, 75% nitrogen, right? There's nothing in there about nitrogen-fixing bacteria adding any nitrogen to the atmosphere. There's already a lot of it in there. So B, I would throw it out quickly. Okay? The next one I'd throw out would be A, to decompose dead plants and animals. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria is mentioned up here, okay? Organisms dying and decomposing happens down here, right? When nitrogen returns to the soil in the form of excrement and when organisms die, okay? So nitrogen-fixing bacteria isn't doing that, right? The bacteria dying, or the organisms dying, is then returning nitrogen to the soil, but that's not directly the role of nitrogen-fixing bacteria at all. So A and B I'd throw out. So let's look at C and D and see if we can't figure out the best answer. C, to turn atmospheric nitrogen into compounds plants and animals can use. Or D, to take nitrogen from blue-green algae and turn it into compounds plants can use. Okay, so they're very similar. The key here is right here. In this sentence, instead, certain bacteria and blue-green algae take nitrogen from the air and through a process called fixation, turn it into compounds that plants can use. So, nitrogen-fixing bacteria doesn't take nitrogen from algae. Algae, along with bacteria, are considered nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So D doesn't quite make sense. And it's not quite accurate. It's close, and it's meant to be misleading. The best answer is just C. Turn atmospheric nitrogen into compounds that plants and animals can use. All right, so 1:45 on the dot. I'll stop there. Again, I will be here for social studies tomorrow, but Caleb will be taking over for science in the afternoon. So I won't see you in science again till Thursday. And thanks again to Caleb for covering for me. If you have any questions, shoot them my way. Otherwise, that's all I've got for you for today. And I will talk to everybody tomorrow. All right. Have a good one.